a very significant moment for two reasons. A, that finally we've been able to get Aspen, Ananta Center Aspen, to come here and spend more time in Bombay, in Mumbai, and have more lectures in Mumbai. Up till now they've been extremely insistent on doing it only in Delhi and Kolkata for some reason. So it's lovely that finally Ananta Aspen Center is here, and with the promise to bring fabulous speakers in this lecture series. Secondly, that it has brought many Mumbaikars to this wonderful heritage monument for the first time today. I'm sure there are loads of us here who have never been here to our own town hall, and it was built in 1830. So obviously we've had a long innings of time to have come here and have enjoyed this space. It's been renovated recently with the effort of the fabulous engineer and consulting architect, Mr. Shirish Patel, who also happens to be here with us. Mr. Patel, if you could just raise your hand, everyone knows what genius looks like. This is a very old building, and I mean, doing anything to it takes a lot of effort and a lot of care and a lot of money. So it is our endeavor to bring the town hall back onto the map of most of the Mumbaikars, to get them to visit here, to get them to look at the library, look at the books, and look at the treasures which it has. I want to recognize Kale Sahab. Kale Sahab here is the president of the Asiatic Society. And apart from the string of wonderful things that he's done for our city, he is now in charge of this library of the Asiatic Center. And we have a huge treasure trove of books, of coins, of artifacts, maps and manuscripts which need to be restored, need to be preserved. He has, with his team, taken out a selection of books for today's lecture, which you can go through after the lecture, on India and China specifically. The oldest book in this collection is from 1733. So you can imagine the wealth of manuscripts and books which our library has here, and it needs to become a huge, interesting attraction for all the people of our city. For the first lecture here today in this series, we have Dr. Anil Gupta with us here, who is from University of Maryland. He's an expert on China, and he is regarded as one of the world's top 50 management thinkers today. It's a huge honor to have you here, sir, inaugurating our lecture series. And it's going to be moderated by my fellow Aspen fellow from the India Leadership Initiative, Abhik Singhi, who is the senior partner at BCG, and he has also authored a book recently which reads the $10 trillion Economy Prize, which deals with India and China and all of the fabulous markets that exist between these two countries. So it's exciting. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope that we'll keep seeing you back for these lecture series as we go on over the months to come. Over to you.
So, good evening everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I'd just like to welcome Professor Gupta. What you would find at your seats is this small handbook which actually has a detailed profile of Professor Gupta. Just a couple of things I'd like to highlight. Professor Gupta is the Michael Jingham Chair in Global Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Smith School of Business. And I think the two things that I'd like to highlight from what he's done is he, in his books that he's written about India and China, actually combines what I would say is the best of academic and business. So his books are easy to read, and especially for people from Mumbai, they are easy to follow from a practical, pragmatic solution perspective. Before this lecture started, we were having a conversation, and I said to Professor Gupta that the audience in Bombay or Mumbai is different from the ones in Delhi. In Delhi, you can actually see the argumentative Indian at its best, at his, her best. You can have a lot of debate about what is not working and what needs to be done by the government, what needs to be done by everybody. In Bombay, we would like to have that, but in addition, we would like to understand what it means for us and what we can do. So while we do have our share of argumentativeness, we are also focused on practicality and pragmatism. The second thing is, if I look at the body of work that Professor Gupta has worked on, I think he has focused on what I would say are the two economies which are going to define and redefine the 21st century. Never before in human history have so many people, we're talking about 2.5 billion people, never before in human history have so many people experienced such an increase in income, wealth and consumption in such a short time period. The only comparable moment in history is probably towards the latter part of the 19th, 20th century, is when the US actually went through a 30-40 period of similar growth. So there are not too many precedents in the past which can help us understand what's going to happen. Those two really are unique. Now coming to the topic of this discussion, which is Make in India lessons from China. One of the things that I have heard many people ask is, when is India going to become the next China? Over the last 15-20 years, this question keeps on coming again and again and again. A few facts. The fact is, if you look at sectors like cement or steel, the Chinese output is 10 times that of India. So China has an installed capacity of close to 2.3 billion tons for cement. India has about 280. In steel, China is close to 700 million tons. India is about 65. And if you look at a time series, it seems that India is about 20, 25, 30 years behind China. Interestingly, if you look at from a per capita perspective, it is not as far behind. It is 8, 9 years behind from a consumption perspective. So what's really happening? And I think the one question on which everybody now agrees to is, India needs to do more manufacturing, we need to generate more jobs, we need to make things happen. And the question really is, how? No longer is there a debate on whether this should happen. No longer is there a debate on whether we should have more manufacturing, more exports. Those are all questions that are settled. The question really is now, how? The focus for today's conversation, and the reason I say conversation, is on issues like this. It's tempting but foolish to try to have the last word. I hope today, in the conversation that we have with Professor Gupta, we can initiate a discussion, a conversation on what needs to be done, and what would be a great outcome is if all of us can walk out with 2, 3, 4, or as Professor Gupta said, 18 things for us to do to make in India happen. Thank you. Over to you, Professor.
And so, just as an overview, the perspective that I take is sort of a single sentence, an overview of my talk, really is what is the Make in China story? So it's a little bit like that if we said, let's look at invent, innovate, and we would be looking at really the US as the role model to figure out. If we said, let's look at quality, we would be looking at Japan. If we are looking at become the workshop of the world, it's fair to say, especially for a country of India, its stage of development, its size, that we would be looking at China. And clearly, it's like if we are trying to become innovative, there are things that from the US soil that can be transplanted here, but not everything necessarily can be transplanted. Quality, many things can be transplanted from Japan to here, but not necessarily everything. And similarly, China, becoming a factory to the world. And so when I talk about my take on what is the Make in China story, I do that not because everything about the China story can be transplanted lock, stock, and barrel. In fact, some of the very obvious things that I say in the beginning are impossible, and not only impossible, but undesirable to transplant. But that doesn't mean that the Make in China story is irrelevant to us. And so that is a starting point. And so of course, if I look at just not just Make in India or Make in China, or really Make in anywhere. I gave a talk recently in Nigeria, and you look at, and sort of really, what does the future hold for Nigeria? And if you're talking about in India, we are desperately and terribly, for good reasons, unhappy that manufacturing to GDP is 13%. Or thereabouts. Nigeria is 4%. Okay? And so if we should hang our head in shame at 13%, you can imagine the challenge that Nigeria, which is another large emerging economy, faces at 4%. And so when of course, so if it's Make in Nigeria, and so, Make in India or any country, there are so many different places where that needs to happen, and whether it's in infrastructure, related or feeder industries, steel, of course, if you build a 700-800 million ton steel industry like in China, that's Make in China too. So Make in China is not just about, let's say, electronics, Lenovo and Xiaomi and so on, etc. So it could be feeder industries. It could, of course, be consumer non-durables, the FMCG type. It could be consumer durables, cars and home appliances and the like. It could be electronics. It could be a manufacturing machinery or construction machinery, or of course it could be export-oriented industries and so on, etc. And China again, over time, they changed their emphasis. And what they emphasized in the 1980s, what it was different in the 1990s, it's different today, and so on. So again, for good reasons, given where we are right now, we may also need to think through as to initially, what the country's focus might be. Now, here are some interesting numbers, and for the sake of time, otherwise I would have posed like a bit of a quiz to say, okay, so today, India's manufacturing is 13% to GDP, and what is China's? And of course, probably most people in the room would have said 25-30%, because China, we know, is well ahead of India in manufacturing. But if I said, what was it like in 1980, okay? And people might have said, well, if India is 13 right now, in 1980 we must be 3%. No, actually India was 16%. Now, I did not invent this data, is from the World Bank, so presumably at least it's moderately recent data. And China actually was 40% of GDP. So actually there has been a fairly sizable gap. But clearly China's manufacturing today is very different from China's manufacturing in 1980. And one of the big reasons why China and India had even a bigger gap in manufacturing in 1980 than today is because China in the around 1980 essentially had no service sector. For example, because it was just coming out of the Cultural Revolution, Mao had just recently died, and so there was nothing like a retail sector, for example. Okay, people wanted to travel around China, so there was nothing really like a transportation sector. So therefore, lots of service sectors which were fairly large in India simply did not exist. Of course, you didn't have a whole lot of consumer goods manufacturing in China, but you had a very large defense manufacturing. And so therefore, the factors that account for the differences in 1980 were the peculiarities of China at that time, the peculiarities of India today. Right? Now, we also, if you look at right now, is that, in fact, I think you talked about when you compared some of the numbers India to China, is that on a GDP basis or per capita income basis, China is about 4.5 to 5 times that of India. But as a much stronger manufacturing power, China's manufacturing sector is 13 times that of India, right? And so, it makes sense that when Mr. Modi and his team talk about that by 2025, let's get India's manufacturing from 13 to say 25, that makes sense, because to go from 13 to 30 or 35, that's a huge big challenge. So that's just to give us a sense for relatively speaking numbers. The other thing, again, in terms of Make in China, Make in India comparisons, is that there is perhaps a little bit of a difference in perspective. And the only explanation I could think of is a little bit of a difference in ideology. So if you look at percentage of GDP, how much is invested in fixed assets in China versus in India? And of the GDP, how much is accounted for by consumption in China versus India? If you look at these numbers, it's very clear that China is an investment-driven economy and India is a consumption-driven economy. Okay? Of course, the question then is why? And one explanation, not the only explanation, I would put forward as a hypothesis is that it has something to do with the ideology. And so of course, the legacy of communism is that in the communist ideology, it's not the consumption that matters, it's the production, right? It's the workers of the world unite, not the consumers of the world unite, kind of thing. And so therefore, the production ethic. Okay, so that's big. There was a reason why Mao was pushing the Great Leap Forward in 1959, and why people were burning their buckets to produce steel. Okay, that's kind of the stupidity behind that. But the whole point was make steel, right? And so and again you look at the background of the top leadership, and so under the current leadership, standing committee, the top 7 people, except for Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister, who has a law background, all the other 6 are engineers. Previous regime, 9 members of the standing committee, every one of the 9 was an engineer. Okay, and so when you have engineers, 9 out of 9 and 6 out of 7, including President Xi, kind of the leader maximum, that they are engineers and they don't have to worry about running for elections, and they come from an ideology where production ethic matters far more than the consumption ethic. Engineers are going to do what engineers know how to do, correct? Right? And which is, of course, build things. And so that's certainly part of the explanation. Okay, and so what kind of the Make in China story, the central piece of that, I think, is that the leadership, and here definitely looking at the period from 1980 onwards, is that they systematically, with gusto and with discipline, attack the factors of production. In terms of the scarcity, try to eliminate or reduce the scarcity and reduce the cost of the factors of production. And the idea was that if the government does that, essentially production will happen. And various different drivers on that governance. And so, of course, China is like a giant big General Electric, 1,000 times over or more, where the governors and mayors of the provinces and cities are essentially general managers, and they are given targets. And except in the last 2-3 years, when the environment is becoming more important, there's been only one target, and that's for GDP growth. And obviously, production and boosting production is a massively important way to boost GDP. Then you look at capital. The banking sector is virtually entirely state-owned. Capital movement is controlled. The stock market is very thin. And so therefore, the Chinese save a ton of money, even more than Indians do as percentage of GDP. So if you are a Chinese family and you save money, short of putting it under the mattress, what you do is you put it into the banking system, into a bank account. But then, of course, the banks are state-owned, and they are essentially policy banks, or we can call them policy banks. And so the interest rate that the banks give to the deposits is not a function of competition with each other; it's policy-driven. And so the interest rates that the banks give is essentially close to zero. I mean, it's like 1%, or it vary between 1 and 1.5%. But on the other hand, of course, so the banks are flush with money, and they can lend money at 5% and so on. So the cost of capital goes down, and cost of capital, as we know, is a hugely important driver of investment into production. We look at labor. Labor is compliant labor. Now, since 2007, the government has gotten very systematic about actually protecting the labor rights. And so labor rights today are actually hugely important, and the situation in 2015 compared to 2007, 2008, like it's a night and day difference. Okay. But until about 2008, labor was absolutely and terribly exploited. Labor unions existed, but the labor unions, obviously, they were appointed by the party, and the goal of union leaders was not to protect workers' rights, was to actually make sure that the workers behave in the service of the producers, okay, whether it's private sector producers or state-owned producers, and so on. So essentially what that does is that it makes labor extremely compliant. Not only that, labor is very disciplined, and the discipline is partly just the power of the Communist Party, but it's also disciplined just in terms of the ethic, because the ethic in China is deriving, certainly over the last 50 years, the ethic of the army. Okay? And Chairman Mao's Long March, the army is not subservient to the party. The army sits in parallel to the party. And so therefore, you go, for example, just as case in point, is say at the Beijing airport, and you see at the turn of the shift, and let's say a new group of men and women who man the immigration counter, and they are coming to take over, and they will march. Okay, that's not an army unit, right? But they will march to their desks because the ethic is that. And so essentially, labor in China is disciplined, but also for much of the history of the last 30 years, it was compliant by design. Okay. The land acquisition. In China, all land belongs to the government. There is no concept of private ownership of land. There is private usage rights. 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, if it's real estate, and so on. But all land belongs to the government, and particularly acquisition of rural land for conversion into industrial, or commercial, or residential land. The government has been very often, in fact, inhumanely on land acquisition, and so on. So therefore, land acquisition is not an issue. And I was talking to the mayor of one of the big cities, and he said, look, if we need to build a highway from here to here, we just basically draw a line, and kind of figuring out how to do that, how to acquire the land, how to relocate people is just a small implementation problem. Okay, kind of thing. Power. Okay, and so once again, the entire power sector is state-owned, and so therefore the power industry is a policy industry. And so you look at infrastructure, building roads, rail, and of course rivers and canals, and so on. So the government has systematically production will happen because you're accelerating that production. Yeah, better? Okay, thank you. Next one, please. Yeah. So, this is just, picking one aspect, infrastructure and so on. And so this is data from McKinsey looking at from 1992 to now, and is very consistent with other data that you see. But essentially, I don't think you can see the numbers, but I can talk about it, is that from 1992 to now, China spent about 8.5% of GDP on infrastructure. Okay? During that time, India spent about 4% of GDP on infrastructure. So it's less than half in percentage to GDP terms, but India's GDP was on average out about 1/3 that of China, which means that for a country of roughly similar size, China spent 6 to 7 times of India, net of inflation, on infrastructure. China started building its highways and so on in the early 1990s. And so what they really did is that the China's infrastructure revolution, bulk of the manufacturing revolution, is actually a story of the last 20 years, starting from the early 1990s, Mao's southern tour and so on. And if you spend 6 to 7 times of what India did on infrastructure, in 20 years you can completely transform the country, right? And so as you look at, Mr. Modi is looking at the next 10 years, and in fact if the Make in India revolution and the infrastructure revolution takes place, actually in 10 years you can indeed transform. 10 years is not that small a time for the city of Mumbai or Delhi or other places to begin to look visibly different and to begin to feel visibly different and so on. And in fact, just to look at how that the Make in China story has rolled out, is that while today China is obviously the factory of the world, but even in China, it's kind of interesting to look at one anchor industry, which is steel. So if you look at, I think we talked about the steel industry, and if you look at the numbers in 2000, the worldwide steel industry was about 850 million tons of production. In China, of that was 129. Okay? And the China number had not gone up that dramatically over the previous 20 years, from 1980 to 2000. But from 2000 to 2013, you look at China's steel production, okay? And so essentially, the Make in China story has evolved over time. In the 1980s, it was not so much about steel or cement or the heavy industry. It was much more about textiles and shoes and toys and so on. Even during the 1990s, it was mostly about that. Okay? Consumer goods and often consumer non-durables. And it really it was in the late 1990s that it began to be heavy industry. And it picked up massive steam during the last 12, 13 years. Okay? And so essentially, 10 years again goes to show that 10, 12 years of kind of passionate push for infrastructure is a long time. It can transform the face of the country, but doesn't have to wait for 50 years. And so, kind of coming towards the close of this brief presentation. So I look at Make in China story as a story in 4 parts. So one is the infrastructure sector and all the feeder industries, steel and cement and so on, etc. And most of that is led by state-owned enterprises. And most of that actually is a story of the last 15 odd years, right? And I talked about the various things that the government has done to push that. Another part of the story is to the bottom right, which is processing trade by foreign MNCs. Processing trade is like Apple, iPhone. So Foxconn makes it. Essentially, the value added in China is about 10% of the total value in the product. Components come in, and you leverage the low labor cost story as compared to steel and cement and so on. It's only in the last couple of years that China has begun to export some steel, but steel or cement have not been export-driven industries in China. They have been feeders into infrastructure, right? Similarly, China is not a big auto exporter, but China is the world's largest auto-producing country, and so again, that's a domestic story, not an export-oriented story. And then you have, of course, mainly domestic consumer goods, and that would be the FMCGs, P&G, Unilever, the like, but also their Chinese competitors. And very little of that is an export-oriented story. It's not particularly capital-intensive, and so it's not big in terms of capital investment, but still it can be quite sizable if you look at the manufacturing value added, which is the value of the end product minus the value of the cost of raw materials. And bulk of that is actually not state-owned enterprises, and the growth in that whole sector has been because what Chinese government did was not so much from a policy point of view, drive the steel companies and cement companies to build capacity, but reduce the cost of the factors of production that I talked about. Right? And then you have the mostly export-oriented consumer goods, right? Because we normally think of China as a massively, as if the U.S. depends on China for, virtually everything. Well, I mean, in a way it's true, very true, and in a way it's not true at all. Because if you go to Walmart in the U.S., it is true that a lot of goods one will find are made in China. But that's basically consumer goods, whether it's you're buying a towel or you're buying, a toy. It would be made in China. But at the same time, I mean, the US also is a huge, big consumer of consumer durables. So cars, that's a huge chunk of US purchase. There's no car that's exported from China to the US. US is also a big buyer of refrigerators and home appliances of other types. Yeah, I mean, small table fans could be exported from China to the US, but refrigerators and washing machines are not exported from China to the US. US is a big buyer of airplanes. And of course, China buys airplanes from the US, doesn't export. So therefore, the export story from China so far is largely a consumer goods story. But because as consumers, we see those products everywhere, we tend to think that China on the export side is taking over the world. It is in many consumer goods, but not if you look at the totality of all manufacturing goods. So, the Make in China has multiple parts to it. The lessons from India, well, so I've essentially, while being, very aware of some of the cultural, political differences between China and India, and so therefore, that's going back to what I was saying, is that not everything can be transported, and some things are a product of the soil in which those practices emerge. But at the same time, one doesn't want to get overly trapped into that kind of thinking either, because then one would say, well, why are the Japanese so phenomenally good in quality? Is because the Japanese, it has something to do with Japanese culture, and so therefore India can never produce high quality goods. Or the US is the global leader in innovation because it has something to do with the US culture. Yeah, of course it does. But that doesn't mean that there is not equifinality, different approaches to reach the same solution. And so we have to find our own solution rooted in our own soil. But if we want to have a Make in India story, we do have to attack the scarcity and cost of factors of production, right? China did it in its own way, and we have to figure out how to do it in our own way. And so I'm sure, everyone in the room, I'm looking at, 28th of February and see what kind of goodies are pulled out of the bag, right? Another is to eliminate barriers to scaling up, right? Because in most business economic activity, but particularly in production, there often are huge economies of scale. And so in China, for instance, there is absolutely no constraint, certainly no policy constraint on scaling up. Okay? So you look at the electronics contract manufacturers, Foxconn and and others in Shenzhen. There's a plant with 800,000 workers in one factory. Okay? And so when you talk about scale, that's what I'm talking about, right? And so we have to actually, create a framework where scale is to be celebrated. Prioritize manufacturing for domestic consumption. And essentially, the reason I say domestic consumption as compared to exports in the case of India, then obviously we should go after every rupee of export, every dollar of export that we can get. But that is different from saying that Make in India should be primarily an export-driven story, because when China began its export orientation, there wasn't the China that they were competing with. Right now in India, we are competing with a China. And right now we run a trade deficit vis-a-vis China. And so therefore, if we can't, in fact, manufacture in India for India's own needs, and we have to therefore rely on Chinese imports, it's a little bit unthinkable that we can beat China in the export market, but we can't beat them in the Indian domestic market. So therefore, domestic consumption needs to be the priority. And within the domestic consumption, obviously, there are sectors that are large, that are very high growth, and so therefore, clearly those need to be high priority areas, whether that's consumer electronics. Already, in fact, the estimates are that India is importing from China about $40 billion worth of consumer electronics goods today. And the penetration of PCs and tablets and smartphones in India is still tiny. Now, in fact, it's not unthinkable that if things don't change, 5 years from now, India will be importing $400 billion worth of consumer electronics from China. Can you imagine that? And so, therefore, if an industry is to go from 40 billion to 400 billion, that ought to be a high priority for domestic manufacturing. Solar panels, Mr. Modi wants to take us from 3 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts by 2022. Well, 3 to 100 is, 33 times. That's a heck of a lot faster than GDP growth rate. So that needs to be high priority. Defense, and so these are examples of the high priority sectors. Be aggressive, but also be patient. So when I say be aggressive, meaning that there is not a day to be lost. So that's what I mean by being absolutely superbly aggressive. But at the same time, we should make, kind of keep in mind that Rome was not built in a day. Or that even in China, despite all of the power of the state, that for instance, the steel industry built up is really a story of the last 13 years and not the last 30 years, right? And so it took time to build China. And the last is that, just looking at the lessons from another sector where India is a global powerhouse, which is IT services, that when India got going in IT services in the 1980s, and people like Narayan Murthy and Asim Premji and Ram Rai, they were playing out their magic, that they didn't say, well, we are a third world country and we are going to start with third world practices. No, they said, the reason why India's IT service sector is what it is because they said, that we may be a poor developing country, but we can adopt systems and processes that are absolutely world class. And we did it. And so if we can do that there, why can't we do that in manufacturing? So that's kind of my story, and hopefully we have plenty of time. Yes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been fascinating to hear so much. I would just like to start off with a couple of questions. So I was making copious notes as you were speaking. The one question that I had is, whenever we talk about the Make in India, there's the question, what to make in India? And if I look at some of the themes that you've put on the last page, it's about where there is hyper-growth, it's domestic consumption. The one question I have is, if we have to get manufacturing up from 13 to 25, that means that we have to grow effectively double than what the GDP is growing.
Yeah.
Right? Consumption is not going to grow at the same rate. Therefore, there has to be some export-led growth also, which has to you had to give a piece of advice to the investors and the entrepreneurs here to say, if you're actually making something for export market, here's what I would keep in mind. What would be the factors that you would keep in mind?
Yeah. So I think I would say, maybe one is the role of the government from a policy point of view, and the role of the corporate sector. And so there are things, especially on the export front, I think where corporate sector has already been kind of doing a number of amazing things. And by corporate, I mean not just Indian corporate, but also multinational corporates that are playing in India. Without any kind of facilitation by the government. Okay. And examples would be, for instance, Hyundai, right? And so Hyundai is a big auto exporter from India. And the reason why they're a big exporter from India is because they just make smart strategy decisions. Is that India is still when they entered, was not a large enough market to justify world-scale plants. But they said we can set up less than world-scale plants and not be very efficient. Or we can set up a world-scale plant and run under capacity. Neither of those two are desirable. Or we can think out of the box and build a world-scale plant that's aimed at both domestic market as well as at the export market, right? And so, but that's really kind of complex manufacturing, right? That's not unskilled manufacturing. Auto forge is another example like that. And so, I think there the government, by and large, doesn't need to do a whole lot from a policy point of view. That if the government keeps doing what it needs to do anyway, I think the private sector will more or less take care of 90% of what needs to be done on the export front. What the government needs to do from a policy point of view would be essentially to create jobs for the, a few 100 million Indian workers who will be moving and who need to be moving from agriculture to manufacturing, from rural to urban. Because it's in urban that productivity improvements can be much greater and for much longer period of time than in agriculture. And that needs to be low-skilled jobs, right? And that's where, of course, like consumer electronics, as an example, right? But that's where, in fact, policy can play out.
The one other question I have is, I was actually reading the book that you were reading, and there was one mention that there is one advantage that India has over China, which is in terms of arable land. So while China is actually much larger than India in terms of size, in terms of land suitable for agriculture, India actually has an advantage. Now, would you consider industries where agricultural inputs actually are a raw material in some sense as an attractive sector for entrepreneurs or investors to look at?
Yes, absolutely. And just to kind of very briefly fill in the numbers, the land area, China 3 times that of India, but 55% of India's land area is arable, 16% of China's land area is arable. Net, India has a bigger arable land area than China does, and China has a bigger population than India. But also in terms of just weather, parts of China is freezing cold, and so therefore, in terms of the months in a year that China's arable land can be cultivated, etc. So therefore, China today is a net importer of agricultural goods, and as far as the eye can see, China will remain an importer of agricultural goods. Whereas India is an exporter, net, and in fact, India's agricultural productivity needs to be a lot higher because the farm sizes are very small, not enough mechanization despite everything that Mahindra has been doing, and so on. So therefore, India is a net exporter. But in fact, as far as the eye can see, India ought to be, along with Brazil and the US, one of the is that they looked at Toyota, the lean mean machine, and basically the process rigor. And they took the process rigor of Toyota in manufacturing, and they brought it to the service sector. Okay, and so I see, kind of often enough a question comes up because I go to China several times a year. A question comes up, oh, when will China beat India in the IT services game? And clearly people are becoming more fluent in English language capability, and the government is desperately keen to have China pick up, and they have a very strong education system, just like India does. But I say, okay, all of that is very good. But it's like General Motors, even after 40 years of studying Toyota, has not been able to figure out how to copy Toyota. So I said, India's IT service sector, its strength, is not just the people, but it's the process rigor. And that process rigor is not that easy for Chinese companies. So what I would say that in the manufacturing sector, that India did in fact figure out how to bring process rigor into services. We do have that process rigor in manufacturing, but right now it's in the more complex manufacturing, like at places such as Bharat Forge and Hyundai and so on, which is a lot more into the machinery, if you will, than the people side. And by and large, most people that I talk to say that in terms of the Indian worker, the process discipline is actually quite weak. I'm sure there are, but that would be one area where Indian manufacturing needs to really be like the Japanese or the Chinese or the Taiwanese.
Sure.
I thought I was actually quite intrigued by your what to make here, and you said cost, scarcity factor and the cost factor, which actually are the figures that I wrote. Right. Now, when you give this example of the brilliance of TCS, Wipro, and Infosys, how would you sort of juxtapose that with that approach? They actually very cleverly take on the scarcity factor in a sense. They gave the cost factor. They fulfilled a very prime need, but in a very high service level orientation, and using absolutely the world-class 24/7 availability. So it was, in a sense, filling a gap very cleverly, smartly, in a manner so that you are customer oriented. So something similar, appropriately relevant for the country, so that the product will be hardcore manufacturing. But I'm still referring to your own hypothesis, that look for those gaps and see how you can tap them.
Yeah, I think that in the IT service sector, for much of its history, it was an export-driven industry, right? And so to that extent, it was a niche industry, and it still remains a niche industry. If you look at the IT service sector, what percent of GDP, what percent of employment, and so on, I'd still call it a niche industry. But when I talk about manufacturing, then I would say that in manufacturing, it's hard for me to imagine Make in India amounting to anything if it remains a niche. I think it would have to be go after anything and everything, from steel to smartphones to agribusiness to cars to tires to toothpaste or whatever, everything. So it's kind of I can say, well, we have to go after everything. I can think of prioritizing, and the priority would be those sectors like consumer electronics, like solar PV, like defense, which are likely to grow significantly faster than the GDP growth rate, and where the country is today basically 100% importer. So those sectors of the economy that will grow faster than GDP, where we are almost a total importer. If we remain an importer, the net negative for the economy are particularly large. Therefore, they need to be the highest priority. That's what I would say.
So I'm going to have the audience ask questions. I
shortage of resources. In fact, India is short of fossil fuels, power, clean water, drinking water shortage. In fact, it will be increased. Global warming is already taking an impact here. They say it will be much worse in a couple of years. So all these have to be factored into whatever we want to do for the next 10 years. And how are we going to do that?
Yeah, I think that is an absolutely brilliant question. And it's a two-part answer. One, I think China essentially said to hell with sustainability until the last 3 years. And now they are taking the environment very seriously and resources very seriously. But India, unfortunately, I don't think can, like China, say, well, we'll kind of grow for the next 25 years and then worry about the environment, for the simple reason that while Beijing is terribly polluted, Delhi is actually worse than Beijing. Delhi, according to WHO, is the most polluted city in the world in terms of air. And of course, we can't really call our water clean water. And so given how bad the situation is in India, that this would be part of kind of, can India adopt the leading edge manufacturing technologies and practices on the sustainability front? And now plenty of work has been done in that area. And that, in fact, I mean, like, in the center of Helsinki, there is a power plant that runs on coal. Okay, and that's in the middle of Helsinki, and all you see is a little bit of steam coming out of the top. Okay, so that's just one of many, many examples one could think of. So I think that yes, I don't think India can afford to either ignore economic development or say we worry about sustainability 20 years from now. But solutions exist, and I think India would need to really, embrace them.
Good evening. My name is Purnima Jori and I work with Ananta. Professor, you mentioned about the linkage between jobs and manufacturing and where some of the answers on the policy side need to be. One question which seems to come up is this missing middle in terms of size of the manufacturing sector. So medium scale enterprises, promoters willing to move from being a small scale enterprise to that middle space which is missing in India. What do you see? Do you see any quick solutions in that space? Because that seems to be a place where many of the jobs can actually be. And what kind of steps do you think are possible in that direction?
I mean, so in terms of really scaling up and the constraints that could come in the way, in the Indian context, my hypothesis is that the toughest constraint historically has been on the labor law side. Not so much, I mean, of course, capital is always a factor, land is always a factor, but that's not a factor in terms of, kind of going beyond a certain scale. But it's been much more kind of labor law. And so labor law reform, which, is not seen as a reason why not to set up large-scale plants, rather than to think in terms of a large number of small-scale plants. And so, because it's true that manufacturing technology is evolving, and one could imagine in certain industries, small plants being economically more viable and more efficient, and so on. But in a lot of industries, there are scale-level economies of scale, or plant-level economies of scale. And so, therefore, we need large plants. And I'm sure there is a reason why Foxconn has a plant with 800,000 workers. So, yeah, I think it's labor law reform.
My name is Bala. I just want to ask you whether it is at all possible to have huge export levels without having Indian brands becoming international brands. And in that context, where do we stand and what kind of learning is required?
Yeah. So, on that, notwithstanding the fact that I used to work for Hindustan Lever, and so, on marketing and so on, a big branding guy, I see a bit of a disconnect between Indian brands and, a powerhouse Indian manufacturing sector, or even a powerhouse Indian economy. Because okay, it's good to create world-class Indian brands, and of course Tata as a brand is globally recognized, including in China. But at the same time, you know, I have no problem with the fact that there is a global brand called Bentley and a global brand called Jaguar and a global brand called Land Rover, and they are, you know, products of British soil, but that they are owned by Tatas. And so therefore, you know, to me, what's an Indian brand is more or less, you know, the fact that it needs to be, you know, it's like Mahindra and Mahindra. Of course, Mahindra is a brand originated in India, but SsangYong, the Korean company, is a Mahindra company, and SsangYong is a Mahindra brand. And if Mahindra wants to attack the American SUV market by using SsangYong, I say all the power to them, you know. So yeah, so I see sort of, I'm not too bothered by that it needs to be India-originated brands.
Just the last question.
Good evening, my name is Anush Puna. Professor Gupta, you spoke about the labor ethic and the difference between the workforces in China and India and how naturally they're born different to function differently. What's been your experience about the difference in the entrepreneurs, the people, the promoters in China and India? How are they different? Are they fundamentally different? And how do you see that affecting the way forward of making India or the culture of driving production?
I think the
If I could just add to that, you know, if you had to say a few lessons from Chinese entrepreneurs, and if one was to transplant that, just depending on what you would say, what would you pick as a few things?
yeah. So in many ways, Chinese and Indian entrepreneurs are alike. Because of course, Indian entrepreneurs I find probably even more than American entrepreneurs to be much more profit cash flow driven. Of course, any smart business person has to be profit and cash flow driven, but you can be excessively. And maybe between American and Indian entrepreneurs, the Indian entrepreneurs are perhaps a little too cash flow and, you know, but of course the cost of capital here has been high, etc. Now, when I look at Chinese entrepreneurs, is that Chinese entrepreneurs, by definition, we say entrepreneurs are not state-owned enterprises, there's a pure private sector, and China has explicitly stopped the private sector of capital. So therefore, Chinese entrepreneurs have had to succeed in a context of scarcity of capital, which has forced them to be profit and cash flow oriented like the Indian entrepreneurs are. So in that sense, you know, they are very similar. They're both very aggressive, very hungry, ambitious, all of that. You know, it's actually once a group of us, IIT alums got together, and some based in UK and some in the US and some in India and so on, and we got to actually compare Chinese and Indian entrepreneurs. And we said, you know, if we had say $10 million, who would we invest in? You know, a company run by a Chinese or a company run by an Indian? And we said, ideally, you'd like to split it 5 and 5. But if forced to, you put the money behind the Chinese. So why on earth would we do that? We're all Indians. Who said we put the money behind the Chinese? Instead, the reason we would do that is that when it came to an ethical question, the Indian would cross the line, but would blink before doing so. The Chinese would also cross the line, but might not blink before doing so.
Okay?
Thank you.
So my last question, and I'm going to draw inspiration from where we are sitting. So Asiatic Society has got one of the only 2 manuscripts of Date's Divine Comedy. And to paraphrase from there, if one thinks about hell, purgatory and paradise, some people may say that Indian manufacturing today is in hell. question I have is, if Indian manufacturing today is hell, and China is purgatory, and Germany is where paradise is, what is it that Indian manufacturing needs to do in order to get from hell to paradise?
I think it's like one of my friends in Europe who is a political economy expert. So I asked him about when will Europe become integrated, and he said, I'm extremely optimistic about European integration, but not in my lifetime. And so I would say, similarly, when would India's manufacturing be like German manufacturing? I would say I'm extremely optimistic about it, but not in my lifetime. And the reason for that being is that, see, I mean, obviously, I'm a big admirer of German manufacturers, but to get the German cost of labor, the German manufacturing is all high-tech and very highly automated. And I don't think India should be aiming for that as the primary paradigm of Indian manufacturing anytime soon. Yes, India needs that time. But from a policy point of view, India needs to create jobs of a few hundred million people, and which means that it has to be the China kind of manufacturing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, towards you.
Thank you, Anil. Please don't bother to turn around. You have a long flight ahead of you. And I really want to say how much we appreciate your doing this. I know your trips to India are very, very few and tight, but thank you for making time for us and for doing this literally on your way to the airport. So an amazing conversation we've had this evening, and thank you for setting the tone for our future conversations. We really, really appreciate your doing this for us. Abhi, thank you so much for coming and doing this. We appreciate having you as a speaker and now as a moderator, so we've seen you in different roles, and we really like that very much. This evening wouldn't have been possible without Aditya's smile. So Aditya, thank you for your support for this. Thank you for your staff who've been absolutely, Saroja and Mr. Raman, who've been just outstanding in their support. And thank you for the fellows, and I'm delighted to see 6 of them in the room today. And of course, Avik and Aditya are 2, and there I see many more. And I'm also delighted to see one of our younger junior Aspen fellows in the room. So it's great to see the Aspen families